Adaptation and use that hashtag that's there on the screen, and just quickly answer this poll so we get a sense of who we're talking to. I know that many people in this conference from listening in all the other sessions have deep interest in climate change, and climate science has come up a lot in the sessions, but it's not everything. A lot of people are working on other problems in this conference, so I wanted to get a sense of how much people in this session were using climate science in their work, and so we can see sort of in real time how people are filling that out. I guess I can submit my own, which would be all of my work all the time. And I'm going to keep this open as we go. And then I'm also going to, the other thing I'm going to let everyone know is that if you are on slido.com and you look at there should be a tab for ideas, and we're going to have we have an open question there that I'm going to keep open for the whole session, which is about what resources and organizations you turn to and use for climate science and for using climate science in mitigation work. And so I'm just going to keep that open so that we can collect information from everybody throughout the session, and then we will after the session we'll compile and try to make this all available to all of you afterwards, so that we can share our wisdom throughout the session and afterwards. Okay, so looks like just from what people are filling out so far, that a lot of people have some familiarity with climate science and some use of it, but it is not the dominant thing of what we're doing. So what we're going to do for the rest of the session, we have a great panel here of people working in different stages of developing climate science to applying climate science into mitigation work. And so we're going to hear some very brief talks from the panel, and then go into discussion. Some questions, I'll take questions from the audience, but also we have some questions both for the panel and that I'd love to hear input on from all of you. Great, so this poll is going to stay open, but I'm going to stop sharing and go over to the slides that we have for the session. Okay, can you all see this? Great.
Looks good.
Okay, so I'm just going to start. As I said, my name is Reed Sherman. I'm the Climate Adaptation Lead at the U.S. Global Change Research Program. Since, as we saw in the poll, not everyone is all the time involved in climate science, you may or may not be familiar with who we are. So I just wanted to put up where I'm coming from. It's the U.S. GCRP is an interagency program of the federal government with a mission to, as it says, to build a knowledge base that informs human responses to climate and global change. And particularly, I want to point out the second part of this mission, which is that it's through coordinating and integrating federal programs of research, education, communication, and decision support, so that most of what we do is not, perform research ourselves in our office, but is to work with all the federal programs at different agencies to make, the federal government response to climate change and understanding of climate change more robust. And it's overseen by principals representing 13 member agencies. And you see all the logos there of the 13 agencies that are part of USGCRP. The other thing I wanted to point out about USGCRP is that our best known product is the National Climate Assessment, which again, you may or may not be familiar with. The last National Climate Assessment came out in 2018. And you just wanted to point out that it is a couple of highlights about it. I hope that you go check it out if you haven't already. It's policy relevant, but not policy prescriptive. So it points out impacts of climate change that policies can respond to, but does not make recommendations about what policies should be put in place to respond to those impacts. It placed a strong emphasis on regional information. So there are chapters about many different regions of the United States and as well as sectoral interests, sectors of the economy. And it assesses a range of potential impacts. It uses case studies to provide additional context. And I also want to point out the last bullet for practitioners that it provides really transparent access to the references, data, and analyses used to create the report. I also am highlighting that because that was my particular role in the assessment. So that if you go into the assessment and you're looking at figures or information, that there's a navigatable way for a user to dig into where the sources of that information are coming from. I also want to point out, before I turn to the panel, that the next National Climate Assessment, National NCA 5, just on Friday is now, there's an open call for public input and comment on the prospectus for it. So it is not yet being written, but right now you can go to globalchange.gov, the USGCRP website, and find a link to where you can submit your comments of what you would like to see in NCA 5. And so I encourage all of you, even if, especially those of you who are not all the time involved in climate science, but have interests that climate science impacts, to let us know your views of what would make the next National Climate Assessment useful and important for you. Great. So I'm also going to put this up again. So please, for all of you, if you joined after I had the first poll up, please join us at slido.com with that hashtag, and that you can put in your answers to the poll, and also look at the ideas tab and submit your input about the resources that you use that we can collect and share. Okay, so now I'd like to turn to our expert panel to give some quick input about their role in using climate science for mitigation. So first, I'd like to turn to Juliet Finzi-Hart from the U.S. Geological Survey. Juliet?
Hi, good morning. Thanks, Reed. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Wonderful. So we are going to not talk too long. We're going to all try to keep to about 5 minutes, I think, to describe our agencies and what we do. And so I just want to first acknowledge that I am a white woman of privilege, and I'm coming to you and speaking from my home office right now, which is in Marin County, which is native and ancestral lands of the coastal Miwok. And so it felt really important to acknowledge that and to thank them for their current and historic stewardship of this land. This is just such an important theme these days. I've been so incredibly pleased and moved and have felt really inspired by this conference so far, that there's been such a focus on really showing and leading our way and how we can be more diverse and equitable and inclusive and representative in everything that we do. So most of you at this conference certainly know USGS. I would assume that we are a science agency. That is our mission. I sit with a group in Santa Cruz, California, which is the Pacific Coastal and Marine Science Center. And I'm one of 3 centers within the Coastal and Marine Hazards Research Program within the USGS. And so there's an office in Woods Hole in Massachusetts and an office in St. Pete. And over the last 3 years, there's been a really amazing effort within these 3 centers to start to work even more together. We've all been sort of tackling basically what you see this gentleman facing in this photo here, coastal change hazards. You know, what happens when water comes up onto the land? How does it impact our land and shape it in beautiful ways, but also in potentially hazardous ways? And so our center is really focused on providing scientific information and products that can be used to reduce risks from natural hazards. So we study everything from shoreline change to sea level rise. We look at the past, the current, and the future. So my role at the USGS when I came in was to focus on stakeholder engagement. I came up in the Sea Grant school, so my DNA is sort of built on talking to stakeholders and trying to understand their science. And one of the really gratifying things over the last several years with this formation of this new program, Coastal Change Hazards, is that there's been this real focus within the program, at least this program itself, and I think it's safe to say USGS-wide, to focus not only on the research that we do and the technical capabilities that we offer, but also to link it implicitly to the users and the stakeholders. So this has been a little bit of a shift, and it's been really wonderful to see how this has been moving forward. We have a brand new website that just launched yesterday, so I'm super excited to be able to share that. And so that is, you see it at the bottom of the screen. So there's where you can see all the work that all three of our centers do. So that's the science piece of what we do. And if you click please once, I'm based in California, so a lot of my work focuses on one of the products that's developed out of CCH, which is the Coastal Storm Modeling System, or COSMOS. So because my role is really in the stakeholder engagement piece of this, I spend a lot of my time sitting in communities up and down the California coast looking at things like this. This is showing 1 meter of sea level rise with the 100-year coastal wave event in San Francisco Bay. And so I spend a lot of time with all different types of stakeholders, from city level officials to community-based organizations, et cetera, to help them understand what we have produced, and then in turn listen to what they need so that we can either improve what we're doing or build out new programs to address those needs. You go to the next slide, please. Because I sit in all these rooms, I have kind of a unique perspective of hearing what the coastal stakeholders are struggling with. And what they're trying to do is the right thing. They're trying to get out there and plan and think about their future, from local hazard mitigation plans, which I suspect a lot of people in this conference are familiar with, right? So looking at your current hazards, to adaptation planning, to sea level rise planning, to development plans for the coastal zone. And really what was going on is that there was this preponderance of regulation and guidelines through the state in California, and coastal communities were sort of throwing their hands up in the air wondering, which one is the leading document, what trumps what, and how do we navigate this? So if you could click one more time, please. Working with some of our federal partners at NOAA and EPA, and then primarily with the state agencies, from the Coastal Commission to the Coastal Conservancy. If you're not from California, that'll mean nothing to you. We went through a year-long process where we sat down and we looked at all the different plans that people have to respond to, and tried to find the overlapping themes among all of them so that we could provide some guidance in how they can align the planning that they're doing. So we looked at what are the big ideas from all the plans, how can you crosswalk them, how can you leverage them, how can one policy, let's say in your local hazard mitigation plan, potentially be in conflict with one of your land use plans. And we tried to identify all of those. We have this hard copy that you see, the planning in California, and then it's all up online. And so this was our attempt to try to provide some tools to help, or a tool to help communities figure out how to navigate all the responsibilities. And what we found, gratifyingly for a science agency, is that the unifying theme in all of them was the science, that all of these need some sort of vulnerability assessment. And so that was what we were able to bring back to the USGS and see how we could develop the science that could support the states in their work. And so the last little thing I'll talk about for now is there was the state and federal kind of partnership that formed. So if you can click one more. But out of that, the feds of the group all kind of came together, and we formed our own partnership for the federal agencies that are dealing with coastal resilience in California. And we've created this group, and what we really wanted to do was understand each other better. There's so many resources that are out there at the federal level, but we don't necessarily interact with each other all the time. And so we thought that the most valuable process of this was understanding what each other had, so that when a disaster strikes, or if you're planning for one, we can point to our fellow federal agents or scientists, whatever it may be, to be able to link back to the communities. So I think I would just close with, usually you show this kind of picture. I'm the dorky one with my eyes closed, of course, because probably like cracking some joke that was probably inappropriate or bad, or both. Thank you for pointing it out. I would normally look at this and be like, wow, this is awesome. Look at all these feds working together in this beautiful picture of government efficiency. But in these days and in this climate, I look at this and go, wow, that's a lot of white people. And so while I'm super proud of the work that USGS is doing on stakeholder engagement, there's more to be done. I think there's, at least within our center, there's been a push to understand, how do we increase diversity within our agency, but kind of coming back out to the science, the geosciences are very, very white. And so while we're doing a lot and engaging stakeholders and trying to engage them from the beginning to the end, there's still some work to be done. And I wanted to acknowledge that and say that that is front in at least in our minds at USGS. And so I will leave it at that and look forward to the next conversations.
Great, thanks so much, Juliet. The next speaker is going to be Chris Clavin from the National Institute of Science and Standards and Technology. Chris.
Agreed. Again, I'm with the National Institute of Standards and Technology. I'm in the Community Resilience Program at NIST, and I'll highlight a little about what the work we do, and then I'll get into some of the points that I think are really relevant to our discussion. So we're at the Community Resilience Program, we focused on 3 major areas of work. One is community engagement, outreach, collaboration, and input. So trying to work with communities and the organizations that represent communities, and those that represent their needs, particularly with regards to scientific input and measurement science. And also as well to developing and delivering science-based tools. So tools to assess resilience, to advance the science of the measurement of resilience. And then also as well decision-making tools, in particular my colleagues working on economic decision support tools. And then lastly, my other colleagues work on disaster and failure studies work. So forensic studies, looking at the metrology, and field studies for data collection, trying to understand a lot of what are the things that we put into place and what we learned, unfortunately, a lot of times after major disasters happen, and what can we learn to improve the processes for how we plan for that. So next slide, please. All right, so my comments are not going to be as much about the specific tools that we develop, although I'd encourage folks that are interested in learning about our community resilience program, go Google NIST and community resilience. You'll find our community resilience planning guide, other tools associated with our economic decision support tool, EDGES, which is available online, and we'd be happy to tell you more about those tools. But I think that my comments with regards to what we're talking about today in terms of hazard mitigation and adaptation planning, my work is related to community resilience planning, and I see that as actually sitting at an intersection of pulling together a number of topics that are related to what Shubha is going to talk about soon, about how FEMA's program for hazard mitigation planning and hazard mitigation assistance, and trying to bridge in a number of topics that I think we've been discussing at the workshop. So let me I'll give you kind of my ideas in terms of where we are right now, and then kind of thinking about the one thing I think in common between, one of the things there are many things in common and complementary to hazard mitigation planning and adaptation planning and adaptation concepts, I believe. But at the end of the day, I think a process generally results in a written document or a plan, and there's processes to get to that. So I'll walk through my thoughts and kind of some commonalities we can begin to think about as we move science and research into practice, and thinking about how that potentially could be used or is interpreted as it's published. So I'll start off with, unfortunately, I think in many cases, the planning process of resilience or hazard mitigation or adaptation often, it takes a significant event. Ideally, I think many of us are probably preaching to the choir. All of us believe we should be starting early, but in many places, in many parts of the country, we start after a major event. Something happened that shocks us into thinking about planning. Reed, if you could click twice for me, please. Sorry, Reed, I'm going to have you doing a lot of clicking here. And the folks that are responsible for doing something about that are at the community level. Justin will talk about his experience later in Nashua and how he was able to pull together resources, but his colleagues and his counterparts around the country, they may not be formally educated or trained in thinking about how to organize many different types of scientific information, and they're seeking guidance. There's a lot of guidance out there. We have our own NIST Community Resilience Planning Guide, which focuses on the built environment and bridging mitigation and recovery-oriented planning, and there are a number of others out there as well too, just represented here. And one of the responsibilities of the communities that are trying to do this is to sort through what guidance is most relevant for them that they can put into practice. So Reed, you click forward 2 more times, please. And then they actually have to go through the analytical process, which I think Juliet and her team did a really nice job of describing kind of how they're planning on, how they're trying to increase the accessibility of that information, and taking what's represented at the top picture, hazard information and projections, and choosing which projections for climate change impacts that are most appropriate for their community, their risk tolerance, the individuals that are represented in the institutions, and the built environment that's represented in their community. And then they have to take this information and transform it into a participatory process, bringing this out to the community, receiving input, ensuring that there are various elements of the community, not just the owners and operators of different elements of the infrastructure systems or economic sectors, but the residents themselves, which may include vulnerable populations or underrepresented individuals as well. And then they have to do something with that once the plan's in place. They have to go find the financing, which I know Shubha and her colleagues are working really hard on, trying to increase the accessibility of that, and my colleagues in other parts of the government as well too. So, but I would say at the end of the day, Reed, click one more time, what do we all want this to look like? And I would argue we all have a similar objective in terms of what we think this should, the types of projects this may look like at the end of the day. And maybe this is up for debate. And click one more time, Reed. So we want this to look like projects that potentially will reduce the effect of hazards, but increase the quality of life in our communities. This is just an example from the city of Tulsa. It's a park. It's a park that floods. It's a detention basin, but at the same time, it serves a number of the objectives of a community. And getting to this point is a non-trivial task. And so if you go to the next slide, please, Reed. So one of the things I think a lot about and encourage us to think about as we think about how we bring in scientific and research information into practice, thinking about what the planning process actually requires as inputs, how it transforms for information and serves the needs of those that have to do something with it. So thinking about what inputs need to go into the process. So is there a common fact base, not just specifically the hazards, but a fact base in terms of the potential, so not just the exposures, but the vulnerabilities of the community, their built environment and the populations that face that, but also as well too, can you actually develop cohesive goals that the community can support? Are there necessary processes and actions that can be developed in that process? So are there strategies to address the vulnerabilities, but also as well to consider and describe with confidence the level of uncertainty in how not only those strategies will perform, but potentially how they could perform under uncertain future conditions. And then the blue wedge, I think probably this is actually really relevant to a number of folks that are participating, thinking about not only do we come up with solutions that result in that park, but the actual process by which we ensure that there's an inclusive process, that various views are represented, and that the process for planning can actually coordinate across a number of organizations that are represented. Then lastly, once a plan is in place, can the outcomes be implemented? Can you actually do the financing? But then largely, can you actually describe the impacts of those solutions as well? And the impacts of those solutions, not only in reducing risk, but potentially reducing the uncertainty in terms of what future exposures a community might have. So I think these are important points to be thinking about in the back of our minds as we're presenting information to communities, something I'm thinking about as we aim to move our research into practice, not just from the point of advancing the science, but ensuring that it actually can move through a rigorous, inclusive process to ensure that we can describe objectively that risk is reduced, but also continue to have community support after something is done. So I'll stop there. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to everyone, and then I believe I'll hand it back over to Reed.
All right, thanks, Chris. So next, I'd like to turn to Shubha Srivastava from FEMA.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so thanks, Reed. Thanks, Chris and Juliet and next will be Justin, but I work for FEMA headquarters in the mitigation planning program. And I think FEMA's role, especially at the headquarter level, but also at the regional level, is the bridge between research to practice is the policy. So the public policy is an important bridge, and the policy and practice of mitigation planning can be really used by states, tribes, local jurisdictions to assess the natural hazards that are exacerbated by the changing climate, and then implement actions to reduce risk, but it can be both mitigation and adaptation actions sort of done together. So we can go to the next slide. In case there's a, thanks Reed. Where are these mitigation plans? If we need a quick idea of that, basically 87% of the country is already has a current mitigation plan, which is FEMA approved. All of the light blue on the map means that the local jurisdictions have approved, adopted plans, mitigation plans for reducing risk. And so the reach of the program is wide. The planning process is already established and repeated every 5 years. Updated plans are formally adopted and then approved by FEMA. That's also part of what we do as FEMA is approve the plans. And then they are also an eligibility requirement for mitigation funding. And so this is an established process. With every 5-year update, there's an opportunity to advance and expand on and the work done so far and take it to the next level. So we can go to the next slide. Going back to how policy is the bridge between research and practice. So we have our 3 stakeholder types of plans, state, tribal, and local, and we have 3 sets of policy requirements for those plans. They're very similar, and they all require the plan content, the plan document, as Chris was saying, to address the probability of future hazard events and changes in development that are occurring and future. So the policy and the guidance, these are 2 of the requirements of the many other requirements that the plan document has to meet. But in our policy and guidance, we talk about the mitigation planning process, which is the top figure there, which is designed to be collaborative, bringing the emergency management, typical planning and mitigation grants to the community planning area. So basically, the planning process helps build relationships and reduce current and future risk by connecting to the land use planning aspect. But and the whole community should be involved in creating these plans in the planning process to understand the risks and to create buy-in for the mitigation action to happen. So all of the wealth of information from USGS, from NOAA, from all these other sources has to be used in the risk assessment part of the planning process so that all of the stakeholders understand the risk and then have the buy-in for mitigation action. So the state policy really emphasized that in the 2015 update of the guide. It really emphasized climate considerations, and after that we saw couple states have done that, and then several local jurisdictions have combine these into planning in these plans together, climate adaptation and mitigation plans already. So we'll look at the examples a little bit later, but how they're doing it, I think Justin's presentation will be more helpful in the how part. But one common theme is and Chris also talked about the sectors, and I've heard the theme of intersectional collaboration, and the sectors that are in the National Mitigation Framework are one way of combining. So for example, the natural, sector, if we take the natural and cultural sector, then living shorelines and forest management or management of agricultural lands, there can be, mitigation actions and adaptation actions that go hand in hand and help that, have co-benefits for that sector. So that is one way of sort of thinking and approaching and combining these. And so keeping our, our introductions and backgrounds short, I basically want to close. I have examples and resources, but basically this is a call for action to use this and leverage this established state, tribal, local mitigation planning process every 5-year update to make that journey from research to practice, to take the climate considerations and get it into capital improvement plans and other community plans for action. Use the best available data to assess the future conditions. Future conditions is the terminology FEMA is using. So it's not just the hazard that's changing, it's also your own, with land use and development, all of the conditions have changed, so you're trying to assess future conditions based on both the hazard changes and your community changes, and then integrate whole community efforts by sector. So the next slide is just examples of plans who have already done it. Massachusetts came out in 2018 and North Carolina just came out with their state plan that have integrated these two. And there are several local plans that have tried it, and early ones. There are a lot of California ones and Washington ones that have tried. And so our state policy came out 2015, but also there have been other executive orders by governors that said, integrate for resilience, and that has really helped bring the adaptation and the mitigation planning worlds together. And then quickly to the resource slide. I'd like to point out a few more resources, not just all are FEMA, but the National Mitigation Investment Strategy has been recently released. It is prepared by Mitigation Framework Leadership Group. It's not only FEMA, it's many agencies are there, but it's a national approach talking about the importance of the whole community, nonprofit sector, private sector, to participate and maximize the impact of mitigation investments. The second one is a report from Columbia Law School on how state mitigation plans have improved a lot in their inclusion of climate change. They compared the 2013 ones to the 2019 ones and showed a clear upwards trend toward higher quality in their inclusion of climate change. Of the 50 plans, they analyzed 39 of the state plans improved in their inclusion of climate considerations. And then the Region 9 Level Up audio series, and it's on the Georgetown Climate Center website now, have conversations. And the first of the 5 conversations is with an immigrants' rights organization on how communities can shift the focus of mitigation efforts from buildings and infrastructure to supporting low-income immigrant populations before, during, and after hazard events. So the whole equity issue of how mitigation efforts typically have focused on, buildings and, systems. And we've heard this from our tribal stakeholders too, that their natural and cultural resources are more important to them than the buildings. And so there is a way to bring this all into this established process. There are other resources for demonstrating the value of mitigation. If you need help with that in your community, there's the Mitigation Matters report from the Pew Charitable Trust, recent one, 2019. Then there's a toolkit by FEMA for outreach to local officials to show the value of flood risk awareness and increase flood risk awareness. And then lastly, there's guidance for green infrastructure projects from FEMA's, the project side. I'm from the planning side. And then last but not the least, the Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities program that's being developed right now, BRIC, has this summer engagement webinar series going on. So there's a link to view those webinars, their YouTube recordings during this month, basically. And then later there'll be more coming out. So given the theme of this workshop, I want to end with that I have active hope that mitigation planning will be used as the path or the vehicle for incorporating climate considerations into community planning. And that way we can make this journey from research to practice. So thank you, and hopefully you found something useful. And with that, I'll get it back to Reed. So.
All right, thanks so much. And so our last speaker before we get to questions, and I already see a bunch of really good questions and comments in the chat, which we will definitely get to. But before that, I'd like to hear from our one representative from outside federal agencies, which is Justin Cates from Nashua, New Hampshire. Justin?
Thank you very much. Good, I guess still morning here on the East Coast. Good morning. I'm Justin Cates, Director of Emergency Management for the City of Nashua, New Hampshire. And I'm just going to give you a brief case study of how we were able to leverage some of the resources and tools that were described earlier during this panel, and actually try and find a way to bring them into our update of our hazard mitigation plan last year. So next slide, please. So Nashua is a city here in New England, old mill city, around 90,000 for population. But for the most part, our hazards primarily consist of both urban and riverine flooding, extreme heat events, major winter storms, the types of things that you would expect for a New England community. But unfortunately, when we looked at the concept of resilience planning and the types of resources and technical assistance that might be provided to communities like Nashua, most of those efforts were focused around the concerns of sea level rise, coastal communities, and not places like Nashua. In 2018, we undertook a pretty substantial effort to identify some resources that could be an opportunity to help us create our first resilience strategy for the city. And this was an idea that really resonated from our mayor and really the community stakeholders who didn't feel that we were doing enough when it came to our hazard mitigation planning. The old way of hiring a contractor every 5 years, running through a real quick project where you get the minimum requirements for the state and for FEMA to approve, not really being inclusive, not really ensuring that it's thinking long-term beyond those 5 years. It was not acceptable to our mayor, and they wanted to see different. So the next slide kind of talks about really the watershed moment for us when we realized that we needed to think further past just the typical hazard mitigation planning that we had done in the past. This is our wastewater treatment plan, and if all of you don't know, wastewater plants are typically in the lowest part of your community for a good reason. But unfortunately, that presents a lot of challenges to emergency managers like myself. When we think in emergency management about consequence management, a flood of this nature at our wastewater plant would really create a lot of problems for our city, as well as many of our neighboring communities and downstream communities. So we said, all right, well, what would be the future impacts to significant rain events, and how would they exacerbate or amplify these really historical conditions that we would be concerned about? And after thinking about some of the concerns from the 1936 and 1938 flood events here in New England, we said that it's going to be easy for us to convince the community that this is a concern that we need to think about. And even though many might not be so supportive of climate adaptation planning here in New England, or at least in New Hampshire, once we convince them that this has already happened in the past and that it's going to be likely that it'll happen in the future, we'll see much more support towards our initiative. Next slide. So to start us off on really leveraging the resources that have been described earlier, it has been mentioned that the Climate Explorer is one great resource to really start to understand what are some of those long-term climate impacts to your jurisdiction. And this was a quick way for us to help to provide our stakeholders with some information about likely precipitation events, droughts, extreme heat, the things that we're mostly concerned as an inland community. And it's, I would say, very easy to access, and it's also a great way for you to share information with your community members as well. On the right-hand side, you'll see the Climate Change in Southern New Hampshire report. That was done by UNH, University of New Hampshire, and climatologist Dr. Cameron Wake. And he actually came out and gave a presentation at our Resilient Nashua workshop, where we went through the process of identifying those climate concerns as they're downscaled to Nashua specifically. So just be aware that there are resources both at the national level as well as in your state and local government that might be able to assist in climate adaptation planning. Next slide. Our overall process that we had utilized was, as Chris mentioned, the NIST Community Resilience Planning Guide, and it's a 6-step planning process that we actually crosswalk to the requirements that Shubha had mentioned from FEMA, as well as other efforts to look at climate adaptation integration within our planning efforts. We also incorporated pre-disaster recovery planning, which is another major concern, because we knew that the only thing that we would probably be able to get support for when it came to pre-disaster recovery planning was ensuring that we had priorities to help get the community rebuilt after a major disaster. So the NIST process really helped us with that. And you'll see on the left and the right-hand side, many of the community partners state and national partners that helped us with technical assistance, including EPA, who had funded this project through their Healthy Communities program, Texas A&M University, who used their Plan Integration for Resilience scorecard process, the National League of Cities, who accepted us as a member of their Resilient Cities cohort, and then also our partners from the state, the Silver Jackets program, who really assisted us with our flood adaptation planning. Next slide. One of the most important parts of hazard mitigation plan is really the strategy to identify what types of improvements you're going to make to your community. And this is, I think, where we fail in most cases. We include these recommendations in each one of these plans, and 5 years goes by and most of them have not been implemented. We haven't even touched it at all. And so one of the things that we did as part of our process was that, what are the realistic things that we can see our community actually moving forward with? What are the things that are already in the pipeline, whether they be gray or green infrastructure? But then also to look longer term, that long-term planning horizon as to those infrastructure improvements and community investments that we can make to actually make some real change. I think the other important piece of this was our integration with the private sector, identifying solutions that they would be able to bring to the table to help promote development in areas that we may have historically thought of as vulnerable areas. Down at the right-hand corner there, you'll see the Resilience Dialogues. That's a program that many of the partners that are on this call had talked about a little bit. This is a program to bring in experts from around the country to help provide some input to your community on adaptation measures that can be done within your jurisdiction. And what's neat about it is they bring together proven examples, things that you can actually implement within your jurisdiction, as well as ways to include your community members as part of that approach. So I would highly recommend to check out the Resilience Dialogue program. Next slide. So I'll turn it back over to Reed, but I want to just close out by saying, really, this is possible. It is possible to incorporate climate adaptation planning as well as your hazard mitigation plan. It just takes the effort, the interest, and I know that most emergency managers aren't really interested in hazard mitigation. It's not the sexy topic that emergency managers really wake up in the morning for, but unfortunately, unless we prioritize mitigation planning and think long-term versus just that 5-year planning horizon, we're going to be in the same boat year after year. Thank you.
Thanks so much. And so we don't have a whole lot of time left in the session, but we do really want to get to some discussion, some questions. So I had some questions, but based on what's in the chat box, I want to first go to a topic that was brought up by a bunch of people in the chat box, which is about considering that we have people from multiple different agencies as part of this panel, as well as Justin from outside agencies. How do we improve the coordination among those agencies so that we don't have mitigation guides or planning guides that are being done in parallel by many different organizations? How do we make it easier for a community to find what they need in one place rather than feeling like they're overwhelmed with guidance from many different places, especially since, as someone pointed out, there are overlapping jurisdictions here that, the natural disasters aren't just one agency's, aren't just part of one agency's mission, but touch on many of our agencies because of our interests. So I wanted to open that, open that question up to whoever is willing to jump in there first.
I can start if that's okay. Oh,
yeah,
go ahead.
Sure,
No, Justin, you're on the ground, Justin, you speak, not me.
Real quick, one of the things that we did, it was actually after we went through the process, it was sort of part of the lessons learned process. We had 4 primary methodologies that we had used to go through the planning process. One was the FEMA Local Hazard Mitigation Planning Handbook. Second was the NISP Community Resilience Planning Guide. Third was the Texas A&M Plan Integration for Resilience Scorecard, and the fourth was the Resilience Dialogues process. And as you can imagine, they've got steps and all of these things that you're supposed to go through a process, and it's challenging to do all of them at the same time. We ended up coming up with a crosswalk after the fact, But those 4 that I'm mentioning are probably just a small piece of the number of guidance tools, resources that are out there to help you through the integration of hazard mitigation planning and climate adaptation planning.
Juliet?
Okay. Thanks. Yeah, so I was just going to say, I heard that comment in there about like reinventing the wheel and wasted effort. And I remember I've only been a Fed for 4 years. I'm leaving next week to go to, it doesn't matter. And I remember sitting in those rooms and seeing, you know, the plans and the guidance and everything, and thinking the same thing. And then I became one, and then I'm sitting in those rooms on the other side of it. And I will say that the stuff that I talked about really came out of stakeholder needs. So where it originated was in California. There was the USGS, and FEMA also was looking. This was one of the first places where they were trying to do their future conditions mapping. There's a slew of consultants out there doing really good sea level rise work, you know, and then the communities were just throwing their hands up in the air, like which model do I use? What you know? So there was first from this call from the communities of there's too much information, there's too many guidance documents out there. We formed a technical group to talk about the science of sea level rise, and then that morphed into the group that then kind of became the offshoot, which was like, there's also the same question from the policy side. So within the state of California, that has been, over the last 5 years, that has been our focus, is trying to figure out how we can live with the existing resources that are already out there, because they're out there and we, you know, they're there. So we need to talk about them and find how we can find the overlaps, and that's what that compass alignment tool is about. I will say that there's also a, you know, parallel effort at the national scale through Reed. You can probably speak to it, but the work that the GCRP is doing, and then the U.S. Coastal Research Program, UCRP. I mean, there's of course a zillion acronyms, but that is something that I think is really at the forefront of, at least at the federal scale, that there are a ton of resources out there, and rather than starting to create new ones, we need to see how to connect them. And then just bringing it back to USGS and the formation of the Coastal Change Hazards Program, that has been central. You know, we wanted to come out there with a new tool, and we've been really fighting our best urges to not create yet another tool, but to sit and think and talk to stakeholders and figure out, well, okay, there's a gazillion things out there. What do we need? You know, what's missing? How can we contribute to that? Is that our own tool? Is that adding to other people's tools? So that is something that is really at the forefront of everyone's minds, of not just putting more stuff out there, but using the information that's available and trying to coalesce it into meaningful alignment.
Yeah, I'll also just add that while hazard mitigation is definitely, it's more tangential than central to USGCRP's mission, at least historically, you know, it is part of our purpose to improve that interagency coordination and make sure that agencies are working together to make these things better rather than all working in parallel and reinventing the wheel. And so this is, you know, that's really what I, you know, try to think about every day and improve. And I think it's also a place where the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy can make a big difference, you know, both in focus, both in what topics they're interested in, but also how they push those topics. That there have been, you know, cases where, you know, the White House will get interested in a topic, but it sort of becomes a feeding frenzy of many different agencies and offices trying to work on something rather than a more coordinated, managed effort. And so I think that that, you know, the details matter in this. Great. Shub or Chris, did you want to jump on this before I move to the next question?
Yeah, so I wanted to say that I do understand and acknowledge the overwhelming feeling. I used to be a practitioner too, and so it's kind of like, you know, what do you use? But from now that I'm, you know, on this side, one size does not fit all. We can, you know, we want to stress plan integration, you know, integrate your plans, but if we make one process put it in your comp plan, some places do not have a comprehensive plan. So you know, so an example that Juliet was talking about, California, so it's maybe for California, this process works because there's the general plan element, and there's this, and there, you know, like there's the framework of that state, that community, that sort of, you know, if you have your economic development plan. So I would encourage to think very selfishly of your situation, community, your state, and see what works for you and use that. I think all our processes are very similar. The processes are similar, and then there's different tools for different things. So if you want to do, and don't think of a lens of this is my FEMA plan, this is my this plan, this is my, you know, it's your resilience plan, and then don't think from the lens of FEMA eligible projects or the, you know, that eligibility. Once you know what you want to do, you'll, you know, there may be some other agency that's funding that action. And so, you know, two thoughts to contribute to the discussion here.
Thanks. And just in sort of in response and noting some other things in the chat, we will save the chat. I'm not sure if it's accessible to all participants. That's a question for our help from the workshop staff. And also, I'll also point out we're not going to get to every question, so please, you know, feel free to reach out to us. You know, that's why the emails are up on the screen. If you have a question for any of us individually, and also, you know, we'll also take them back to consider. So the next question I wanted to open up to the panel, it was about, you know, we hear that while we talked about some accomplishments here, there's, you know, we also recognize there are challenges in doing this well. And I wanted to ask about whether, in your view, what the balance is between that, whether we have shortcomings in the research to apply or shortcomings in applying the research. You know, is there a knowledge gap in the science that's appropriate to use, or is the difficulty really in translating the science that exists into practice? And so one to open up to any of the panelists who would like to tackle that first. And also for any participants, if you have views about that, you know, please go ahead and share them in the chat.
So maybe I'll start off, and then maybe I'm sure others will have input as well too. So I think this, for me, this goes back to, I'm going to continue our discussion on what we were just discussing as well too, to some part, that one of the challenges gets to the local and very specific needs of different end users, the types of sectors they're interested in, the types of endpoints they're interested in as well too, and the type of resources they have available to them as well too. Every time I think about the work that Justin did, for example, I'm continually impressed because he was able to pull together a number of resources and processes and scientific and research information, and that's a non-trivial amount of work to pull that all together. And I think one of the challenges, I imagine many of those in the room on the researcher or the practitioner side, is trying to figure out how to generalize those questions that many organizations have over the various topics, whether it's climate impacts, projections, downscaling, all the way to what process we pick as well too. And so I think that's just I don't think it's a shortcut. So I'm going to say the challenge is not on one specific side, but on trying to generalize what can be a very localized and very personal to a community's needs for how they incorporate this information for their own populations, and specific their infrastructure built environments needs as well. So anyways, that's my 2 cents on that.
Anyone else want to tackle that? Justin, not to put you on the spot, but especially, you know, from your side, to be curious to hear if you ran into a problem with information existing or in the use of that information.
Yeah, so in our plan that was developed, one of the things that we had highlighted in there was the challenges with keeping good information as to previous historical impacts, as well as understanding the future potential impacts, especially in areas which are currently being developed. Just trying to understand the the changes that those structures, those infrastructure projects are going to create to our watershed and to other components of our infrastructure is really tough for the layperson, and I consider myself a layperson, to really understand. And then in order to really get good actionable information to help inform your mitigation strategy or your adaptation strategy, you really need the expertise of your city engineer, in my case, community planners, people who are experts in those fields. And they're already busy with 1,000 other things on their plate, just trying to deal with the current infrastructure construction projects that they're working on within the city. They don't have time to spend on this plan that is going to probably look at days that are far beyond their retirement age within the city. So it is challenging to try and convince these folks to assist and participate in your planning process. But I think one of the things that we were able to do in Nashville was to bring in such a diverse set of stakeholders. Everybody from the soup kitchen to the country club, we're sitting in the room as part of those stakeholder meetings. And I think because of the diversity of organizations and community members that were in the room, I think many of those city departments that had the expertise felt a need to be there, because if they didn't show up to the meeting, it wasn't going to look good for them, especially with so many community members taking time out of their day to participate.
Great, thanks. And Juliet, you have something to add?
I do, and my wireless just went out, so another Zoom, another weird technological problem. So I don't think you can see me. Anyway, I think I'm flustered by my technology issues, but the only thing I would add is that the one thing that we face a lot is the battle over how granular you need to get with the science. And I'm sorry, battle is probably not the right term, but the challenge around how granular you need to get with the science. So, the group that I'm with develops the coastal storm modeling system, and that's a regional scale model. And it's, very sophisticated. It's got state-of-the-art information. It's using all the historic information we can get our hands on and then projects into the future. But when it comes down to it, when you have a community or a landowner that wants to build in the coastal zone, there's often this kind of discussion over, well, is the regional scale information enough? And do I need to bring in my geotechnical engineer to look at my particular cliff? And the question, we get sucked into this a lot, both at the legal scale and then just at the community planning scale. And I think that remains to be seen as to, and I think the points that Shubha and Chris were making and Justin about every city is different and every need is different is valid, but I think there's a conversation around just how detailed the science needs to be to actually plan. I mean, we're seeing a lot of information come out at the parcel scale. And is that really necessary? Does that really help a community move forward? I think I sort of would put that back to Justin. Is the parcel scale level information really what's needed? Because we spend a lot of our time talking about that. And I wonder if it's not so much a question about, is there a science need, but is there a translation need, or is there a need for more scientists sitting in the rooms and working with the coastal communities? I'm sorry, I'm speaking solely about coastal because that's my focus, but in any of these natural hazards, so that there's a better understanding of what the science is showing and the information it's providing.
Yeah, and I'll say we had this, or we continually have this issue with the national climate assessment, is that depending on the climate impacts, some of them are national in scale, some of them are regional, and some of them are local, and some of them are down to like the block scale, or individual property, and there's only so much that one report can do, but considering that there is that variation is really important to convey. One thing, we have 1 minute to go, and I wanted to also point out, since someone asked about saving the chat, that anyone participating or attending this can save the chat. In the corner of the chat box, there should be a button with 3 dots in it, and if you click on that, there should be a chance to save the chat. So I know some people have shared good resources and things to check out there, so encourage anyone to do that. I guess we've run out of time. So I'd like to thank everyone on the panel again. for sharing their wisdom and insights. Thanks everyone to attending and all the things that were posted in the chat. Really great perspectives and questions. And I wish we could have gotten to more. And please, as I said, reach out to us by email if you have anything to follow up with us individually. And looking forward to the rest of the workshop. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.